I was too curvy for his family's table, and Sabina Belrose made sure everyone knew it when she sent my chair away. "We hold our standards, Miss Hart," she said, smiling at 13 people who did not correct her. I stood there in the dining room of the most feared man in Boston, holding nothing but a serving spoon. So I did the only dignified thing left. I lowered myself onto the Persian rug with my plate, crossed my legs, and said the view from down here was much more flattering. I did not expect the boss to stand up, walk around the table, and sit on the floor beside me. That rug was worth more than everything I owned. The people around it would not have traded one thread of it for my dignity, but I am getting ahead of myself, and I should not, because what happened on that floor was the ending of one story and the honest beginning of another. Neither part would have happened if I had kept being grateful for a chair that was never really offered to me. To understand it, you have to understand that I had spent years learning exactly how much space my family believed a woman like me should take up. It was not one big cruelty that taught me. It was 100 small ones, each too minor to protest, until the pattern itself became the injury. My name is Celia Hart. I was 36 years old, a closing shift cook at Rosebridge Senior Residence outside Boston, and I lived in the guest house behind my Aunt Lenora's home in Brookline. Guest house sounds charming. It was one room above the garage, and I paid for it in gratitude, which was more expensive than rent. My father had died owing money to the kind of creditors who send certified letters, and I had chosen to settle those debts rather than walk away from his name. Lenora's roof made that possible, and Lenora never let me forget it. Lenora was 68, polished, and never openly cruel. She believed social embarrassment was worse than unkindness, so her unkindness always arrived wrapped in manners. She said my name warmly at parties, and introduced me as her dear niece who was so good with food, and somehow I always ended up holding a tray. Her daughter Paige was 39, married to Julian Belrose, and photographed everything that glittered, and glittered was the key word. At Lenora's anniversary party that spring, I passed shrimp for 2 hours before Paige waved me into the family photo. Then she looked at the screen and said, with a laugh that apologized for nothing, "Celia, sweetheart, you take up half the frame. Step out and take one of us instead." I took the picture. Everyone smiled. I joked about my future as a photographer, and nobody heard what the joke was covering. Later that week, I was cleaning the church kitchen, where I volunteered on Thursdays. I stacked the last clean pan, looked at my reflection in the dark window over the sink, and said a quiet prayer. I did not ask for money or romance. I asked God not to seat me anywhere that required me to become smaller to belong. I said amen, turned off the lights, and honestly expected nothing. Prayers like that usually travel in one direction. I wiped down the counter, locked the church door behind me, and drove home to a room that was not mine, in a life that mostly belonged to other people. Rosebridge Senior Residence was a Belrose property, which mattered more than I knew. I led the closing kitchen shift, which meant I received the deliveries, checked the invoices, and signed for what arrived. On a Tuesday in late April, a produce invoice crossed my desk with a vendor reference code that did not look like any inventory code I had ever seen. It looked like a project number. I knew the shape of those because the Rosebridge expansion plans were pinned to the staff bulletin board, and the project numbers printed on the drawings matched the pattern in front of me. One odd code is a mistake. I checked a month of old invoices and found 4 more, always on large orders, always from the same 2 suppliers. Kitchen people learn early that patterns are never accidents. A delivery arrives late every Friday, someone is skimming the driver. A supplier shortens the invoice, someone is skimming the kitchen. These codes were skimming nothing. They were pointing somewhere. I could have shrugged and filed them away. Instead, the next morning, I asked the residence manager for 10 minutes with the property office downtown, and by that afternoon, I was standing in front of a man whose name made ordinary people lower their voices. Marco Belrose was 51, head of the Belrose family in every sense the newspapers whispered about, and the legitimate ones they printed. His office was quiet, his suit was dark, and his attention, when he gave it, felt like being read by someone who never missed a line. I set the invoices on his desk and said, "Somebody is using your food deliveries to talk about your buildings. I do not know why, but the numbers do not belong to my kitchen, and I thought you should know." He studied me for a long moment, and then he told me something that explained why he had agreed to see a cook at all. For nearly a year, confidential Belrose development bids had been reaching a competitor within days of being decided. Each leak followed the family's sacred Sunday supper at the Belrose estate. His people had swept the house for devices 3 times and found nothing, because, he said, he was beginning to believe the information was not being stolen by a machine. It was being carried out by someone who sat at his own table. He said it flatly, the way a man says a diagnosis he has already made peace with. But his hand tightened once on the edge of the desk. He could not investigate his family openly without tearing the family apart before he had proof. Then, he said the thing that changed my life. "You are connected to my family through your cousin's marriage. You notice what people like me overlook, and my relatives will see a cafeteria cook and stop thinking." He laid out a proposal with the calm of a man ordering lunch. For 6 weeks we would be seen together publicly, letting his family conclude I was his new romantic interest. Then I would attend Sunday supper as his guest, watch and listen. "I was not decoration," he said. "I was the one pair of eyes nobody at that table would respect enough to hide from." He was offering money, and I admit I needed it. But what I heard underneath the offer was stranger and better. Someone with everything to lose believed my eyes were worth borrowing. I should have said no. Instead, I asked him 2 questions. The first was whether anyone would be hurt. He said the point was to prevent it, and I believed him enough to continue. The second was what happened if the evening became dangerous or simply unbearable. He thought for a moment, then said, "A signal. Something only a kitchen person would do." There was a silence while he chose his next words. "And Celia, the moment you use it, we are done for the night, whatever I think. Your limit is the limit." I suggested the large silver serving spoon, which belonged on its platter beside the roast. If I moved it onto the bread plate, I was done, and the night ended, no argument. He agreed without hesitating, and that, more than anything, was why I said yes. If you have ever wondered what it would take to sit at a table where everyone has already decided you are beneath them, stay with me, because the answer surprised even me. And if stories about ordinary women outthinking powerful families matter to you, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely decides which stories get told next. Now, back to the 6 strangest weeks of my life. The cover required Marco to court me in public, and his idea of public was my cafeteria. Twice a week for 6 weeks, Marco Belrose stood in the lunch line at Rosebridge holding a plastic tray. The first day, the entire dining room went silent. Mrs. Abernathy, who was 91 and afraid of no one, looked him up and down and said, "Young man, the fish on Fridays is a rumor. Get the pot roast." Marco got the pot roast. He always waited his turn behind the residents. He learned the servers' names by the 2nd week, and he never once let the 2 quiet men who drove him intimidate anybody. We sat at the corner table and performed getting to know each other, and somewhere along the way the performance started telling the truth. He asked why I was paying debts I had not created, and listened to the whole answer without once suggesting a shortcut. Once, when a server dropped a tray and the whole room turned, he was on his knees picking up forks before I could move, and he did it so naturally that I understood he had done it 100 times for people who could never pay him back. I asked why a man with his reputation remembered that Mr. Okafor, in room 212, took his coffee with 2 sugars. He said, "An empire is just people, Celia. The ones nobody counts, Decide whether it stands. It was the kind of sentence I would have mocked from anyone else. From him, watching him refill Mrs. Abernathy's water glass on his way back from the kitchen, I believed it. By the 5th week, rumors had done our work for us. Paige called me, which she had not done voluntarily in 2 years, to say in a wounded voice that dating into her husband's family without consulting her was aggressive. What she meant was that I had stepped into a photograph she considered hers. Lenora invited me to the main house for the first time in months, to explain over tea that Marco Belrose was not a man, but a weather system, and that I would be blown away. Neither of them asked the one real question, which was what he saw in me. They had already decided the answer was nothing, and they found the idea baffling rather than wrong. What he saw in me, I was starting to understand, was the same thing I saw in him, a person performing a role for a family that had never asked who they actually were. The difference was that his table had cost him only his honesty. Mine had cost me years. On the last lunch before the supper, Marco set down his fork and said, quietly, "You can decline. The signal is not the only exit. Saying no is also an exit." I told him I had spent my whole life declining tables. I had declined Lenora's seating plans, Paige's photograph lines, the place at the edge where helpful people stand. This time, I wanted to see one from the inside. Marco studied me the way he had in his office, like a man reading a contract he intended to honor. He nodded slowly, and something in his face changed, though neither of us named it. The Belrose estate on Sunday evening looked exactly like what it was. Old money, guarded by newer men. Julian Belrose, 43, handsome and vague, shook my hand at the door and forgot me before letting go. Paige photographed the entryway flowers, and in the dining room stood Sabina Belrose, 72 years old, Marco's paternal aunt, and the senior financial authority in the family's legitimate businesses. She wore gray silk and a smile that had been perfected decades before I was born. She looked at me the way a person looks at a chair placed incorrectly, and she said, "So this is the little cook." It was not a question, so I did not answer it, and I watched a flicker of surprise cross her face when I simply smiled and said good evening. The table was set for 14, and it was beautiful in the way museums are beautiful. Everything under glass, nothing meant to be touched. Handwritten menu cards in cream and gold stood beside the centerpiece. Sabina controlled those menus herself, Paige whispered, as if describing a charming eccentricity. I read the card, and something in my cook's brain tilted. The courses were wrong. Not fancy wrong, sequence wrong. The sorbet after the roast instead of before, a second starch where a green belonged. No kitchen writes that. Someone had edited this menu who did not understand food, but cared very much about the order of it. I filed the strangeness away, the way you file a hot pan, carefully, without letting go of it. Dinner conversation was a fencing match I was not armed for, except that I was. Sabina asked where I had studied, and I said the school of feeding 300 people by noon. She asked about my dress, and I told her it had pockets, which was more than her silk could claim. Each answer earned a thin laugh around the table, and each thin laugh encouraged her. Marco, at the head, watched his aunt with an expression I could not read, and twice I felt him about to speak and stop. I told myself it was strategy. A colder voice in me asked what it cost him to wait. Then the coffee was cleared and the roast came out, and there was no chair at my place. I had stepped out to the washroom, and in those 3 minutes my chair had simply been removed. Sabina did not look at me when she said it. 14 is such an awkward number, and the table does have standards. The girl can take a tray in the kitchen, surely. She must be used to eating standing up. Nobody moved. Paige studied her napkin. Julian examined his glass. Lenora's voice in my head said what it always said: "Do not make a scene. Scenes are for people who can afford them." My hand tightened on the doorframe until the wood edge hurt, and the hurt was clarifying. If this moment just made your blood rise, tell me in the comments, should Celia have walked out, or stayed and fought from the inside? I read them all, because I want you to know I stood in that doorway for one long second and felt 36 years of stepping out of photographs, taking the picture, passing the shrimp, laughing at the joke about my own body. Something in me finished. I walked to the sideboard, picked up my plate, and then I did something that looked like nerves, and was not. I lifted the large silver serving spoon from its platter and set it down neatly on the bread plate. The abort signal. Then I sat on the Persian rug. The floor has a better view, I said, and cut my roast. From here, everyone's shoes are honest. A few guests gasped. Sabina's smile hardened into something real for the first time, and it was not pleasant. Paige's camera stayed down for the first time all evening. There was nothing in the frame she wanted to keep. What happened next, I will remember when I am 90. Marco Belrose set down his napkin, stood, walked the length of his own table while every face turned to follow him, picked up his plate and his glass, and lowered himself onto the rug beside me. A 51-year-old man in a $4,000 suit, sitting cross-legged on antique wool. He took a bite and said, "She's right. The shoes are honest." The silence in that room had weight. Sabina's fork made a small sound against china. "Marco," she said, each syllable controlled, "you are the head of this family." He chewed, swallowed, and answered without looking up, "I am. That is why I am not eating at a table that removes chairs from women." No one spoke again for what felt like a full minute, and then conversation restarted the way a car restarts in winter, reluctantly, in pieces. Sabina presided over a table her nephew had abandoned, and every glance she sent our way landed on us like dropped silver. Marco and I finished dinner on the floor. Under the noise, he said one quiet sentence meant only for me. "You held longer than anyone I know." I answered, "That was the last time," and he said, "I know." In the car afterward, I was shaking, and I was angrier than I had ever been in my life. "You let it build," I said. "The job, the dress, my body. You waited." Marco did not defend himself, and I will always respect that he did not. "The operation was yours to end," he said. "The moment you moved that spoon, it was over, and I would never have taken that choice from you by deciding what you could tolerate. That part was duty." He looked at me then. "Sitting beside you was not duty. The investigation ended the second you signaled. Nothing I did on that rug bought me 1 inch of advantage. I just could not let you be humiliated alone." The car was quiet for a mile. Then he added, almost to himself, that no one had ever eaten on the floor of that house and won the room, until me. I want to be honest with you about what that did to me, because it confused me for days. A man who had spent a year hunting a leak in his own family had just watched his trap collapse to keep me company on a carpet. Every practical voice in me said that was the performance, that a man like Marco turned even tenderness into leverage. But I had watched him for 6 weeks behind the lunch line, and I knew the difference between his public face and his real one. What scared me was not that it might be fake. What scared me was how much I wanted it to be real. A woman who has been useful all her life learns to suspect being wanted. Wanted is usually just useful wearing a nicer coat. He drove me to Lenora's guest house and waited until my light came on, and I stood in my one room over the garage and looked at my life with new eyes. I had a roof I paid for in shame. I had a family that cropped me out of photographs. And I had just eaten dinner on the floor of a Mafia estate, and it was the most respected I had ever felt in any dining room. The prayer came back to me then, the one I had said over the church sink. I had asked not to be seated anywhere that required me to be smaller. I had not expected the answer to arrive as a man willing to abandon his own chair. I sat on my narrow bed and laughed once, alone, because the Almighty apparently had a sense of humor about seating arrangements. Here is where the story turns, and I need you to follow the details, because a cook solved what a crime family could not. 2 days later, Paige posted her usual Sunday photographs: flowers, silver, the handwritten menu card beside the centerpiece. She always did. That evening, Marco called me. The competitor had just moved against the exact bid figure discussed at that supper. He sounded tired in a way I had not heard before. "It is Paige," he said. "Her posts precede every single move. Julian's wife. My family will eat her alive." Something in me went still. I thought of Paige mistaking service for affection my whole life. Then I thought of the menu, and I said, "Do not touch her yet. Send me every photograph she has ever posted from those dinners." Marco sent 3 years of Sunday photographs to my phone, and I sat on my bed with my father's old reading light and spread my life across a quilt. Paige in front of flowers, Paige's hand on silver, and in almost every picture, the cream menu card, Sabina's careful handwriting, the courses in their order. I did what a cook does. I read the menus. Most were normal, a sensible flow of soup, fish, roast, sweet. But on certain dates, the order broke. Sorbet after the roast, 2 starches, a sweet before the cheese. And when I matched those strange dates against the list of leaked bids Marco had given me, my hands started to shake. Every single leak followed a scrambled menu. Every one. The order of courses was carrying numbers. It took me one more night to see how. Sabina used a code so old-fashioned it was almost innocent. Courses in their natural order meant nothing, but she had a fixed list: soup is 1, fish is 2, and so on through the sweets. And by rearranging which course came first, second, and third, she spelled digits. A bid of 41 million became fish, then soup, then roast, where a sane kitchen would never put them. To anyone else, it was an eccentric old woman's menu. To an outside broker who knew the key, Paige's innocent photograph was a telegram. Sabina had been transmitting confidential figures through dinner, in handwriting, in public, for a year. The brilliance of it was the hiding place. Nobody sweeps a centerpiece for listening devices. Nobody suspects a roast. Paige was not the spy. Paige was the antenna. Sabina positioned the flowers, told her where the light was flattering, made sure the menu card stood clear of the centerpiece, and Paige, desperate to be seen as the family's gracious chronicler, photographed exactly what she was told to photograph and posted it at exactly the hour she was praised for posting. Sabina had turned my cousin's vanity into a mail service. I sat on the floor of my guest house surrounded by photographs and felt something unexpected: pity. Paige had spent years learning that approval was the only currency that mattered. Someone had simply been spending hers. Now I will tell you why Sabina did it, because it was not money, and that is what made it dangerous. She did not sell the bids. She leaked them so that Marco's redevelopment strategy, his community projects, his Rosebridge expansion would fail again and again in ways that looked like incompetence. She wanted the family council to conclude that Marco's judgment had gone soft and to shift financial authority toward her branch, toward Julian, her son, who knew nothing about any of it. She was not robbing the family. She was sabotaging it politely, at a table it was forbidden to question, using the one place no one would ever search for a crime: tradition. And I finally understood that the coldness I had felt from her at dinner was not snobbery alone, it was the assessment of a general finding an obstacle. I brought all of it to Marco on a Thursday: menus, dates, figures, the pattern laid across his desk like a hand of cards. He read for a long time. Then he said something I did not expect. "She taught me to hold a knife." His voice was quiet. "After my father died, Sabina ran the Sunday table. She decided who sat where, who spoke, who mattered. I told myself keeping her at the center of things was respect." He looked up. It was not respect. It was fear wearing its Sunday clothes. I asked him what he wanted to do. He said, "I want proof so clean that no one at that table can pretend not to see it." And I said, "Then we give her a number only she could send." The plan was mine. and Marco insisted everyone know it was mine. He would let Sabina, in her normal financial role, see one deliberately false figure, a bid of 27 million on a waterfront parcel the Belroses had no intention of buying. If the competitor committed against that decoy, the chain was proven, because the false number existed in exactly one place, Sabina's briefing, and could travel by exactly one route, her menu. I agreed to return to Sunday supper to confirm the encoding with my own eyes. Marco asked me twice if I was certain. The second time he said, "Last time you walked in as my guest. This time you walk in as my colleague, and colleagues can refuse." I was. This time, I was not walking in as bait. I was walking in as the trap. The second supper was the strangest meal of my life, stranger than the floor. A proper chair stood at my place beside Marco, placed there in silence and noted by everyone. Sabina greeted me with warm hands and warm words, and I understood that I had been promoted from insult to threat. She served a flawless meal, soup, fish, roast, sweet, in perfect order, and Paige photographed the table at 9 o'clock, as always. I watched the menu card all evening. It never changed, and when I got into Marco's car afterward and said, "She didn't send it," he answered, "I know. She is waiting for the number to matter." The following Sunday it mattered. Marco's office let the 27 million figure breathe where Sabina could see it, and that Sunday the menu broke. I watched it happen in real time. Sabina drifted to the sideboard before dinner and made 3 small corrections to the handwritten card, murmuring to the server that the fish had not looked fresh, that her digestion preferred the sweet early. To the room it was an old lady's fussiness. To me it was a signature being written. The reordered courses spelled 2, 7, and the qualifier that meant millions. Paige photographed it at 9. By Tuesday morning, the competitor had committed resources against the Belroses' $27 million waterfront bid, a bid that did not exist, on a parcel we had never wanted. The broker would lose money chasing a ghost, and every dollar of that loss would point back up the chain to one handwritten menu card. Here is what no one at that table understood until Marco laid it out in front of the family council that Friday. Only Sabina had seen the false figure. Only Sabina's menu had changed that Sunday. The competitor's move matched the decoy to the digit, and the same pattern, menu change, photograph, competitor move, repeated through 3 years of Paige's photographs, which were time-stamped and public. It was not a confession, but it was better. It was arithmetic. There was no room for a story to hide inside it. I was there when Marco presented it, because he refused to present it without the person who had read it first. My legs were not steady walking in. My voice, when it mattered, was. Sabina did not deny it for long. People like her do not confess, they explain. She said Marco had been beguiled into weakness, that the family was being spent into sentimentality, that she had done what strong people do when the head of a family goes soft. She said it all beautifully, and then Marco removed her from every Belrose financial and development role, froze her authority that afternoon, and told the assembled family one sentence I wrote down afterward, so I would never forget it. Sunday supper will never again decide who deserves basic respect. There was no violence. There did not need to be. She had lived for influence, and it was gone, and she knew exactly who had taken it. A cook. She looked at me once before she left the room, and in that look I saw her recalculate everything she had ever assumed about which people count. Paige came to the guest house a week later. She had seen the photograph's role in everything, and she understood now that the woman whose approval she had arranged her whole life around had regarded her as a decorative delivery system. She cried, and she apologized, and some of it was real. I made her tea and I did not forgive her, not yet. I told her that understanding harm is the beginning of changing it, not the end, and that she could call me when she had practiced being different somewhere it cost her something. It was the kindest true thing I had. She left, and for the first time, I felt no debt to her comfort. Watching her go, I realized the photograph incident that spring had been a gift. It showed me the frame before I wasted more years trying to fit inside it. Lenora expected me to stay, of course. She said so, in the main house, over tea she had let me pour. This has all been very dramatic, but you live here, Celia. Family is family. I had already written the check. That afternoon I paid the final portion of my father's debt from my own savings, every dollar earned standing over steam tables, and I told Lenora I had rented a small apartment in Jamaica Plain and would be gone by the 1st of the month. She said I would struggle. I said, probably. She said Marco Belrose would not carry me forever. I said, he has never carried me once. And I went home and packed my boxes, and nobody photographed it. I carried the last box down the garage stairs myself, and the silence from the main house behind me felt less like rejection than like weather moving out. Marco offered no payment for the work, and I want to tell you why that mattered, because at the time I half expected a check and half resented that I expected it. He understood that money at that moment would have turned everything between us into a transaction, gratitude into leverage, and that I had spent enough years paying for shelter with pieces of myself. So the public romance ended the way it had begun, deliberately. No more cafeteria lunches with an audience. No operational reason to see each other at all. 3 weeks passed, then 4. I told myself the floor had been a moment, and moments do not owe anyone a future. I was lonelier in my own apartment than I had ever been above Lenora's garage, and it was a better loneliness, the kind that belongs to you. I hung my father's photograph. I bought 2 chairs at a second-hand shop and recovered the seats myself. I cooked for myself on Sundays, alone, and discovered that a meal cooked for one person who respects you, even if that person is you, tastes entirely different. On a Saturday in June, my phone rang, and Marco's voice, stripped of every audience, said, I would like to have dinner with you. Not as your boss, not as an investigator, and not pretending. If the answer is no, it will not cost you anything. That last sentence is why I said yes. He had learned the shape of my whole life without my ever explaining it. He arrived with flowers he carried slightly awkwardly, like a man unused to errands done for joy. I had cooked, of course, pot roast, because Mrs. Abernathy was right about the fish. And when he shrugged off his coat and looked toward my little table, I did something I had planned all afternoon. I ignored the 2 good chairs. I spread a blanket on the living room floor, set the food out on it like a picnic, and sat down. Marco looked at the blanket, then at me, and I watched him understand completely. He sat down beside me without a word, 2 people in their 30s and 50s eating pot roast on the floor of a rented apartment, by choice. That is the whole meaning of the story, so I will say it plainly. The first floor dinner said, you cannot humiliate her alone. The second one said, neither of us has to earn the right to belong here. My prayer over the church sink was never answered with a better chair at somebody's table. It was answered by discovering I could leave diminishing tables entirely and still be chosen, sitting on the floor, by a man who had given up the head seat without being asked. We did not get married that summer, and I will not pretend a lifetime. We had dinner the next week too, also on the floor, because the chairs had become a joke we both loved. Marco took the floor like a man who had decided some furniture is only decoration, and I decided that a man who sits down beside you is worth more than any seat he could offer. I was never too curvy for his family's table. The table was too small for anyone's dignity, and it took a woman who fed 300 people by noon to notice, and a dangerous man to prove it by sitting down. If Celia and Marco's second supper meant something to you, like this video and subscribe for the next story. And tell me in the comments, what is the table you finally walked away from, and who sat down beside you? Your story might be the one that keeps someone else standing tall. Thank you for staying until the end.